Every great book has that one chapter that changes everything. And your life? It's no different. But before the best chapter begins, there's always a blank page, one that most people are afraid to face. It's as if the universe, right before unveiling its best plot twist, requires you to embrace the silence that comes before the shift. Carl Jung once said the unconscious is the true author of our story, and those moments of crisis, those stretches of standstill, are actually signs that a new narrative is about to unfold. Think of your life as a gripping novel, the kind you just can't put down. Each phase, each struggle, each win and loss adds a page, shaping a story that's yours alone. But, just like in the best novels, there's always that turning point, the part where everything seems to fall apart, only to come together in a deeper, more meaningful way. Maybe you're in that moment right now. Maybe it feels like life's on pause, like nothing adds up anymore. And the path that brought you here no longer fits who you are. That's what we're diving into today. The idea that emptiness, crisis, chaos, they're not roadblocks. They're doorways. That before the most powerful chapter of your life, you have to pass through the blank page. You have to trust the process and allow what's next to be written through you. So stay with me till the end, because this might be the chapter your story's been waiting for. It usually starts with something small, a quiet feeling no one else notices, a restlessness you can't quite explain, a sense that something's off, even if everything looks fine on the surface. At first, it's subtle. Maybe it's waking up with a heaviness, or a sudden wave of frustration, or just a constant urge to be somewhere else, doing something else. You try to brush it off, keep pushing through the routine, force yourself to feel grateful. But the feeling returns. It lingers. It grows, until it becomes too loud to ignore. That's the first sign. The invisible nudge telling you something inside no longer fits the space it's in. And this is where most people get it wrong. They think that discomfort is a problem. But in truth, it's a message. Jung understood this better than most. He saw discomfort not as a flaw to be fixed, but as the soul's way of saying, time to grow. Something needs to change. And what once felt bearable now starts to hurt, because you've grown past the point of accepting less. That's why, right before major breakthroughs, so many people hit crisis. Maybe it's discontent with work. Maybe it's a relationship that no longer holds truth. Or maybe it's just a nameless ache that lingers through your days. A quiet, constant reminder that something has to shift. And this kind of discomfort doesn't go away with distractions. In fact, it gets louder when you try to tune it out. Because it's not here to ruin your life. It's here to pull you out of a version of yourself that no longer fits. It might feel like you're falling apart, but really, you're being realigned for what's next. When the discomfort finally speaks louder than fear, it's a sign that something in you is ready to move forward. Even if you can't see the path ahead, the fact that you no longer feel at home in the old one, that alone is a beginning. After the discomfort comes confusion. You realize you can't keep living the way you used to, but you still don't know what's next. It's like being caught between two worlds, one that no longer fits, and one that hasn't yet appeared. In this in-between space, everything loses its clarity. The landmarks that once guided your steps no longer work. You try to move forward, but the road ahead is still shadowed. And yet, going back is no longer an option. This is when the mind starts to doubt everything, including you. You question your decisions, wonder if you're really changing or just fooling yourself again. But this storm isn't a mistake. It's part of the shift. It's what happens when you're deep in the curve of transformation. The Kybalion describes this through the principle of polarity. Everything in the universe has two poles, light and shadow, growth and retreat, doubt and clarity. But these aren't opposites. They're just different points on the same spectrum. So when you feel lost, you're not off course. You're just moving through a denser part of the same path that leads to clarity. What you're feeling isn't permanent. It's a state in transition, and your awareness evolves as you move through it. Jung saw this same process in what he called individuation, the journey of shedding who the world told you to be so you can become who you really are. But that journey isn't paved with logic. It runs through breakdowns, and confusion is one of them. The mind lets go of its certainties because it needs to make space for what hasn't been integrated yet. And in that vacuum, the unconscious starts to stir, not with clarity, but with a quiet pulse that begins to rearrange everything. The new self doesn't speak yet. It simply beats. Most people try to escape this stage. They run, retreat, stay busy so they don't have to feel. But those who walk through it, without knowing exactly how, tap into something deeper. A presence that doesn't depend on answers. You don't need certainty to keep going. You just need to keep going. This moment that feels like an end is also where everything begins to rebuild. Even when you understand you're in a transition, there's a part of you that wants to pull it all back. That insistent inner voice whispering, "Let's not mess with this now. You're overthinking. What if it's just a phase?" That's resistance. It sounds logical, even caring, but beneath its careful tone, there's fear. Fear of the unknown. Fear of letting go of what was, even if what was doesn't make sense anymore. That force trying to keep you in place isn't weakness. It's just your ego doing its job, protecting your current identity. Jung explained that the ego forms to give order to the chaos of existence. It wants safety, consistency, and any deep change feels like a threat to that. So it resists. It tries to reason with your pain, justifies choices that no longer fit, doubles down on patterns you already know don't work, all to preserve the familiar script. But the more you ignore that inner shift, the heavier everything gets. Because the ego might convince your mind, but it can't fool your body. And that's when the symptoms show up. Anxiety without a trigger, exhaustion that won't go away, a disconnection from everything that once felt certain. Recognizing resistance is crucial. Not to fight it, but to listen. Resistance always holds a key insight. What exactly are you trying to protect? What are you so afraid of? What feels so risky about letting go? That listening, uncomfortable as it may be, opens the door to a more mature internal dialogue. And little by little, the ego stops being an enemy and starts becoming an ally. It still hesitates, sure, but it begins to understand that transformation doesn't mean destruction. It means reorganization. When you learn to meet your resistance without letting it stop you, something shifts. You realize you can be afraid and still move forward. You can have doubts and still choose what feels true for who you are now. And that choice, even if made in silence, already begins to loosen the grip of the old self. But when the ego starts to crack, what surfaces first isn't instant relief. It's a storm. All those emotions you've been holding back begin to rise. Sometimes it's anger, sometimes sadness, fear, insecurity, guilt, shame, feelings that were buried but never resolved. It's common at this point to wonder if you're going backwards. After all, things seem to be getting better. You were growing, becoming more self-aware, and suddenly, it feels like everything's collapsing inside. But this emotional spiral isn't regression. It's depth. Jung called this the confrontation with the shadow, the part of your psyche where all the traits you had to hide live. The pain you silenced, the impulses you suppressed, the wounds you never addressed. These pieces of you come up the moment change begins. Not to sabotage you, but to be seen. The shadow doesn't want to destroy you, it wants to belong. The issue isn't feeling anger, sadness, or fear. The issue is not knowing what to do with it. The issue is trying to bury it all again, pretending you've moved on, chasing distractions, faking positivity. But this kind of transformation doesn't happen at the surface. It demands the courage to sit with discomfort, the courage to feel all the way through, the courage to look honestly at what hurts, without numbing it. Some of life's most real changes begin the moment you stop fighting what you feel and start listening to what those feelings are trying to tell you. Because every emotion has a root. And the more you try to ignore it, the more it repeats. Sometimes through your body, sometimes in your relationships, sometimes in patterns that feel like déjà vu. When you can hold space for emotional chaos without getting swallowed by it, something deep begins to reorganize. You stop being ruled by hidden triggers and start gaining clarity about what actually needs healing. This is one of the hardest parts of the journey, but also one of the most freeing. Because as messy as it feels, feeling is what cleanses. It's what transforms. Emotion only fulfills its purpose when it moves through, and it only moves when it's allowed. Not analyzed, not explained, just felt. By now, you're no longer running from yourself. You're finally beginning to come home. And after that inner storm, the scenery begins to shift. Quietly. There's no big announcement. But something starts to stir. An unexpected conversation that changes your perspective. A sudden idea that lights up your mind. Someone new who enters your life as if they were always meant to be there. These are invitations. They don't come with guarantees. They don't arrive wrapped in certainty. Most of the time, they look like coincidences, small, strange synchronicities. But Jung didn't believe in coincidence. He saw in these moments a symbolic intelligence, the unconscious speaking through the world around us, linking events that on the surface seem unrelated. As you soften your defenses, stop resisting your feelings, and begin listening to what life's showing you, these signs appear more often. Not because the world changed, but because you did. And suddenly, you start to notice what was always there. An invitation to change. You just couldn't see it until you were ready. These opportunities don't shout, they whisper. And often, they wear the mask of uncertainty. Maybe it's a career path you never considered. A pull to study something new. A desire to live somewhere else. Sometimes, it's a breakup that hurts, but clears space for something more aligned. The new rarely walks in through the front door. It seeps in through the cracks left by everything you finally had the courage to let go. But accepting that invitation takes presence. Because it doesn't offer safety. It offers risk. The risk of not being liked, of failing, of losing the control that the old cycle, however stifling, used to give you. And yet, that's where everything begins. Stories of real turning points almost always share this one thing. There was a moment when someone decided to follow a feeling they could no longer ignore, even without knowing where it would lead, even with fear, even without approval. But something inside said, go. That go doesn't come from the head. It's a calling, and it only arrives after you've shed enough layers to finally recognize what's true, even if it doesn't make sense yet. When the new calls, it doesn't explain. It invites, and it's up to you to respond. Recognizing the call isn't enough. There comes a time when you have to choose. This is where many people freeze, because realizing the old no longer fits, and that something new is calling, still isn't the same as choosing. The choice comes later, when you can't hide behind questions anymore. When you can't pretend you didn't notice. The scary part isn't the change itself. It's what it asks of you. Responsibility. Because once you choose, what follows isn't random. It's consequence. And owning that takes maturity. It means no more blaming others, no more self-sabotage when things get hard. Jung spoke of free will not as total freedom, but as deep responsibility. You can't control everything that happens, but you are responsible for how you respond. And every choice, even the quiet ones, shapes the reality around you. That's why this moment is so tender. A lot of people postpone the leap for years, waiting for guarantees, for a divine shove, for a sign so obvious there's no room for doubt. But the truth is, the clearest sign is always the discomfort of staying where you no longer belong. And then it happens, the moment when staying hurts more than the risk of changing. That's when the decision is born. It doesn't have to be loud. Sometimes, it starts with a whispered enough, a quiet no, spoken with certainty, a timid yes, spoken with truth. These small decisions, stacked one on top of the other, are what rewrite the story. What matters is that it's real, that it comes from somewhere deep inside, not from urgency or emptiness or expectation, because the new only holds steady for those who step into it whole, even afraid, even without a map, but with truth. To decide is to cross an invisible line. After that, going back means leaving parts of yourself behind. But it's also after that line that life begins to respond differently. A decision is like flipping on a light in a room you've never entered. Suddenly, you see walls covered in old marks, furniture that no longer matches who you've become, forgotten objects that once made sense, but now just take up space. It's jarring. You had no idea you were carrying so much. And now, with the light on, there's no way to unsee it. This is where real transformation begins. And it doesn't start with dramatic gestures. It starts with the discomfort of realizing how much you need to reevaluate. When you choose from a place of truth, the world around you begins to reconfigure. Not as magic, but as consequence. You notice it in the details. A habit that no longer fits. A place that suddenly feels foreign. Conversations that no longer flow. Spaces that once felt safe now feel tight. Everything begins to align with the new frequency you've chosen to hold. That's when change stops being a desire and becomes a practice, a presence, a posture. It's in the new boundaries, the silent sacrifices, the firmer choices, even when no one sees them. Jung called this individuation, the process of becoming who you already are on the inside, but haven't had the space to express on the outside. It's not a leap. It's a path. A slow unfolding of your truest self once you stop living to please or hide. And that unfolding sometimes requires an inner revolution. Some people move cities. Others end long chapters. Some simply start saying no more clearly. And that alone shifts everything. There's no formula. But there is a sign. When you start feeling more whole at the cost of letting go of what kept you fragmented, it's working. Of course, the old will try to pull you back. But the more you root into this new inner place, the more you realize it's not about becoming someone else. It's about finally stopping the escape from who you've always been. And in that moment, even if things around you are still catching up, you already know. Going back is no longer an option. When going back is off the table, the road ahead narrows. Not for lack of options, but because from here on, only what's true can come with you. And often, that means walking alone. This is an inevitable part of the process. Solitude. Not just physical isolation, but that deeper kind, where it feels like no one fully understands what you're going through, where certain conversations no longer click, where the frequency has shifted and not everyone followed. It's uncomfortable, but profoundly necessary, because there are seasons when the outer noise needs to fade so you can finally hear what's pulsing within. Nietzsche once said, "He who cannot endure solitude cannot be free." He wasn't talking about isolation as ego, but the kind of freedom that comes from not needing constant validation. In ancient Greece, solitude was seen as essential for philosophical thought. Socrates walked among crowds, but reflected in silence. Spinoza, rejected by his own community, wrote his greatest works alone. Simone Weil once said, "Pure disinterested attention is a form of prayer, and true attention only arises in quiet." It's in this space between the old and the new that you begin to see yourself more clearly. It's not comfortable, but it is illuminating. Many people turn back here, return to distraction, to the crowd, to the rush. But those who stay find something that can't be found anywhere else. Consistency, clarity, autonomy, a kind of peace that doesn't depend on anyone. On this channel, we've got an entire playlist on solitude as a tool for self-discovery. Not the kind that isolates in pain, but the kind that cleanses, reorders, and deepens. If this topic speaks to you, check it out later. It might be exactly what you need right now. Because in that quiet space, something powerful begins to happen. You become the very presence you've been searching for, and that changes everything. Not because the pain vanishes, but because you finally know you can hold who you are, without applause, without an audience. You start to notice the shift, not in some grand way, but in subtle moves. You respond more calmly to what used to throw you off. Choose silence over over-explaining. Realize that what once hurt you doesn't hold the same weight anymore. These are the small victories. No one sees them. No one claps. But you feel them. These quiet moments reveal that something has changed. Not out there, but within. And it's this quiet shift that truly anchors the new chapter beginning to take shape. After moving through such heavy terrain, it's easy to expect big signs from the outside. But the real proof that it's working? It's when you start treating yourself with more respect. When you guard your energy like it's sacred. When you stop contorting yourself to fit where you don't belong. Jung said growth doesn't happen in straight lines. It comes in waves, often subtle ones. And it takes sensitivity to notice when an emotional tide recedes and leaves something more solid in its place. This is when you begin to notice progress you'd have missed before. The day you said no with peace. The moment you stayed present without escaping. The hard conversation you navigated with honesty. The decision you made without guilt. These wins won't show up on a social feed, but they'll transform the way you feel about yourself. Because they reveal something crucial. You're laying a foundation. A foundation that doesn't wait for the chaos to end. That doesn't need life to go easy before it lets you live differently. Every small win is a quiet affirmation. You're becoming someone capable of holding the life you asked for. And while they may seem like minor details, it's those seemingly insignificant decisions that lay the groundwork for lasting transformation. Because no one becomes someone new overnight. But every day, you can choose to act as someone more whole, more awake, more aligned with the person you're becoming. The secret is in noticing and honoring. Because when you learn to recognize your own progress, even without an audience, The universe takes notice. It sees you're ready for something more. In Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha, there's a pivotal moment. Siddhartha, the main character, has walked every promising path. He's been a Brahmin's son, an austere ascetic, a disciple of the Buddha, a wealthy merchant, a refined lover. Yet peace never comes. None of it fills him. It's only when he sits by a river, alone, no longer trying to become anything, that something shifts. There, in absolute silence, he listens and understands. Life doesn't demand blind effort. It demands presence. Flow doesn't come from control. It comes from surrender. That's the moment when a new cycle begins. In fiction and in real life, you no longer need to fight your feelings. You don't need to constantly prove you're ready. Things begin to move. A project that stalled for months suddenly finds momentum. A lost contact reaches out. A yes you had written off reappears. An invitation arrives, and it doesn't ask you to shrink to be accepted. These are the signs, not of the end, but of the beginning of the turn. Carl Jung taught that true transformation happens when the conscious and unconscious stop fighting and start working together. When your rational mind no longer blocks the movement of your soul. When your outer actions begin to reflect your inner truth. That's when life begins to flow. And flow doesn't mean ease, it means alignment. You say what you mean without undercutting yourself. You feel fear, but don't stop. You enter spaces and no longer shrink. You take a stand, not to please, but because you know where you stand. Opportunities don't appear like magic. They show up because you've become aligned with them. You've become the ground where the new can grow. Your relationships deepen. Conversations feel more real. Even your challenges change. They strengthen you, not drain you. You don't need everyone's approval. You don't have to chase what's already coming your way. You just need to stay aligned. And maybe for the first time you look around and realize you haven't arrived yet, but you're moving. With ease, with direction, with structure. And that alone is a win. You might not see huge external changes yet. Life might still feel quiet, simple, maybe even a little dull. But if you've come this far, you know, you're no longer the same person who started this journey. And that alone marks the beginning of a new chapter. Not when everything finally works out, but when you realize you can keep going without guarantees. When not having all the answers doesn't paralyze you anymore. When your presence matters more than validation. Jung said life asks for courage to be lived in truth, and truth doesn't always shout. Sometimes it speaks in the simple act of continuing, of choosing yourself in silence, of holding a higher frequency even when no one sees. This chapter that begins now, it isn't the prize. It's the reflection. A reflection of every time you faced your shadow without running. Of every choice that seemed small but broke an old pattern. Of every moment you resisted the urge to go back just because it was easier. You've passed through doubt, confusion, and solitude. You've felt what it's like to lose your footing, to break from the familiar, to face emotions that threaten to swallow you. And still, you moved forward. Maybe afraid, maybe slowly, but you moved. And now, even if there's no applause yet, something inside you has stabilized. It's clear. It's ready. This is the ground where the best chapter of your life begins. Not with exaggerated promises, but with real coherence. Not with magic, but with awareness. Not to impress anyone, but to live with more presence, more truth, more wholeness. If this video found you in a moment of transition, of exhaustion, of almost giving up, maybe it's the reminder you needed. This isn't the end. It's the crossing. And if that hit home, leave a comment below. I'm ready to live this new chapter. Write it with intention, as a commitment to yourself. Mark this moment as a turning point, not because everything will change tomorrow, but because you already started living differently today. If this video spoke to you, if it walked with you through a meaningful moment, and you feel called to support this work, there's a thanks button below. Even the smallest financial support makes a real difference. It's what keeps this channel growing, reaching more people, and delivering content with depth, care, and consistency. If you feel moved to contribute, know that it's received with deep respect and gratitude. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next video.